All right, so good morning again. This is, I believe, our session 3 of looking at things from the new supplement, All Creation Sings. And we're just sort of continuing on my ever-growing enormous PowerPoint. So I think it's up to like 127 slides now. So we are doing a bit of a backtrack, just slightly. Last week we ended having just finished Susan Briehl. But with only one hymn text in the new supplement. But I said there were several more, but I couldn't find them because I believe that they're going to be in print in a hymnal for the first time with All Creation Sings. Just last night, I finally found a couple of resources that had them in sort of pseudo-published state. So we're going to backtrack just a moment and pick up the few that I found. But you're really going to have to forgive the playing because it literally was like 5 seconds this morning before we sat down, at least trying to plunk out the melodies. But Susan Briehl, as I said before last week, an ELCA pastor, also sort of adjunct professor of theology at Valparaiso and other Lutheran schools. Her husband was for many years the bishop of the Eastern Washington, Idaho Synod, and a lot of work out with out in the West Coast Lutheranism, Holden Village, and several times collaborated with Marty Haugen, that sort of thing. All right, so we looked at this one last week, Your Canopy of Lights, this new piece that was printed a few years back for an evening service with Marty Haugen, but here are the ones that I discovered as well. So according to the list, this hymn will be in there, God Alone Be Praised, which she did the text and with Zeb Hyben for the tune. But there are two tunes he wrote for this text, and I don't know whether we're getting both of them or one of them. They haven't told me. They just have the name of the composer and the name of the person. So here they are. They were both written, commissioned by the Association of Lutheran Church Musicians, which is the American Pan-Lutheran sort of musicians professional society, musicians, but also pastors, liturgists. I know, Linda, you're a member. I don't know, Connie, if you're a member or not. Don and I are members.
I am a member.
You're a member, yeah.
And I've been a member since, I think, 1995. It's a wonderful organization. And I was there when they sang both, at the conference when they sang both tune arrangements to this text. It was really exciting.
So you can help fill in some gaps that I probably don't have. But this was commissioned for the 30th anniversary of the association. Based on Psalm 46, which Lutherans love so well because that's what Luther used as the basis for a mighty fortress. But this was kind of a new 21st century thinking. So I'll try the best to kind of plunk along at some of this, but you can see one. That was a terrible rendition of what Mr. Hyben wrote, but sort of an attempt. The other tune follows right up, and then we'll talk just a touch about it. This one I think I'll do even worse, but I will say, at least just purely off the top, one thing that I think makes both of these, to play them slightly hard, and I worry a little bit about their adoption, is that Zeb Hyben changes keys halfway through each of them. Both times you have to change. Not too hard, but at least for some church musicians who are perhaps more amateur in their skill, that's an extra step to remember that you have to think one thing and then switch. But what do you, Linda, do you want to share a bit about what you
Well,
experienced?
the only thing I would say, yeah, I mean, for me, the second one is easier. Zebulon often creates pretty sophisticated melodies and choral works. As a church musician, I did not usually use his choral settings because they were just a little bit too challenging for an ensemble of about 20, but I think the second one is easier, you know, even though it switches keys and modalities, it's, I think, a little bit simpler to sing, but that's just me. I think the rhythm is a little bit easier also in the second one, and I think the text is great.
Yeah, I think at least listening to the concertatos on both of them, the second tune I think was sort of meant to be a little bit more of that classic organ with brass. The first one almost has a slightly like pianistic or even Asian kind of feel a little bit. It's more, they're both beautiful, a little more challenging. I will say, so some of these that I found, this is good, and there's a long tradition of this, but a little bit of this are things that seems that Augsburg Fortress has published as anthems over the last sort of 10 years, that they're sort of, I guess, the best of them, they're repackaging as congregational hymns, right? So often a concertato will have, you know, choral things, and then maybe the last verse, the congregation joins on that melody. Well, it seems like several of them, they're putting the whole thing melody in here. So that's some of the ones I stumbled across, was actually literally going to each anthem and copying off the back page. So, but these are two that we'll be receiving. But a lovely new paraphrase of this old wonderful psalm to hear in really fresh ways. I don't have a whole lot more to say about it, but that just wanted to kind of throw it out there. And of course, we love anything that ALCM has. As we, a couple weeks ago, we talked about Voices Raised to You We Offer. That was, I think, for the 25th anniversary. So this was another commission. All right. This is another Susan Briehl, but this time with Bob Farley. And both Zeb Heiben and Bob Farley, I have more information about them in a couple of slides down. So I won't talk about them until then. I actually think this is a lovely tune. This is also brand new to me, though. But we can attempt sort of singing through it if you just sort of hum to yourself. Otherwise, you'll drum me out. But all in Christ behold God's word. Actually, I find that a quite nice tune, quite nice, very rolling. I'll give you a chance to sort of look through the text a bit. I'm actually sort of curious where exactly this will be put in the hymnal. I have at least one guess for where it might be, but I'm curious where you think it might go.
Guys, do some of you know how to move our pictures so that we can see the entire text? Does somebody know how to do that?
It should be kind of floating in the right corner, Connie. If you scroll up toward, is it like in a bar that drops down the right side?
The pictures, yeah, the 4 pictures are on the right side and they're blocking out
Yes.
that
So,
text on page 2.
So if you take your cursor to the top box picture, there should then be like a little skinny one, a single box, and then like 2 boxes. Do you see that, like icons?
Yes.
If you click the farthest one to the left, they'll all disappear. The middle one will just show the person talking, and then the column one will show all of them.
Got it.
Oh, shoot.
Baptism, harvest would.
Yes, I was definitely thinking there's certainly baptism imagery here, right? About both being baptized, wrapped in the cloth of Christ. There's also a bit, though, of like the promise of life of everlasting life, right? You get a little bit of that in it, I feel like in the second verse particularly. But also I love that the binding shroud is here released, the veil of sin and grief, and in their place. So this kind of how baptism undoes what death does. And rejoicing in God's promise strong.
Definitely baptism, actually.
It's a nice evangelical text in the third verse too. Let's go talk about this love.
Yeah. Yeah, and well, that verse, especially the second half, right? I love that how it's I think Susan Briehl often likes to sort of what is that called in poetry? Where you sort of say two things almost the same way, one after another, right? But in Christ abide, in Christ behold, the world beloved, the whole in love. You know, like she sort of does that a lot in her hymns, which is quite lovely. Faith we cling, gladly sing. I mean, it's also just rhyme, but it works very nicely. Okay, we are going to kind of move along, so just stop me if there's ever one that you really want to talk more about. So this is actually Zeb Heiben, who we mentioned earlier. He is a ELCA, Lutheran composer, trained at St. Olaf, among other schools, Luther Seminary in St. Olaf. He is now, as of just of 2019, the recently appointed director of music and an organist at Duke University, Duke Chapel. But he is an ordained deacon in the ELCA. One of the offices we have, particularly a lot of our musicians can go through the program to be a deacon. Has a lot of things published, particularly by Augsburg Fortress, our publishing house, and Morning Star. And actually that's Duke Chapel down there at the corner. So that's where he plays every week now and directs the choir. But this hymn is another time that he and Susan Briehl have collaborated, was a commission by the Institute of Liturgical Studies at Valparaiso University. And it was for the Christus Rex, or Lumen Christi. So this is Christus Rex, the center picture, at the Chapel of the Resurrection at Valparaiso University, my undergraduate alma mater and Connie's. The Institute, throughout its history, and really Valpo in general, for as small as schools is, has had a really big influence on the liturgical life of the American Lutheran churches in every decade, and continues to. So this is an annual conference of theologians, pastors, musicians, liturgists, and several years ago, they actually, one of the things they've added is that now every year they commission a new hymn. And this was the inaugural commission. So to try to, and particularly they're to try to fill in hymns that we maybe don't have as many texts on that lectionary taste. So this is one of them. So it is also a little bit sophisticated to play, I will say. And this is definitely an organ accompaniment, not a piano one, but we're going to see if we just get the flavor of it. Lift up your hand, ye voices raise, hear the living water flow, drenching up your room. Na, 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 na. It is a beautiful tune. I think this one is slightly easier to adopt because it doesn't at least change keys and modes during it. But it's certainly more in that sort of grand, full composed style. The melody itself is kind of, I feel like, not as easy. Lift up your hands, your voices low. He doesn't like to pick one key signature. Likes to move around, but I'll give you a second to look at the text. And see if you can guess when this was written for. Any guesses where it's from, for what it's for? Or what, I mean, it could be used for various things, but what it was originally intended for?
Lots of Easter references and even communion. I also like the Psalm 24, lift up your heads reference, which is often for Advent, but it's great.
Yeah, so
I start every verse is different. Lift up your hands. I can't even read it.
lift up
Heads,
your hearts. Yeah.
hearts. Yeah, it's terrific.
Hearts, yep.
Mm-hmm.
So you're right on Easter. So actually, and I will admit, this would not have been my initial guess. It kind of took a minute to, oh, really? The commission was to write a new text and tune for Easter 2 in year C. So those lessons. But you do get a touch of, I think a lot of our Easter 2 hymns are always doubting Thomas and Thomas touch, Thomasy. But I think this is more aimed at the first part of the lesson, right? Where they're all gathered in the locked up room. They're all mourning and afraid and sad, and how Jesus meets them, right? And so I think that we actually get that in a couple of different lessons. So I think that's an interesting piece that it kind of deals with that. It's very embodied too, which was the theme that year, right? It's very touching, physical. But it would certainly be good throughout Easter and anytime we really baptism and communion, because it wants to talk about, which I think is important, that our spirituality is not just a matter of the head, right? We don't just think about God and we experience God, right? We receive God physically in the bread and the wine. We receive God's grace in the water. We are God's hands and feet to one another physically. So I think there's been a push toward renewing that. And I think this hymn does that a little bit, right? It wants to push that physicality of our faith. But you certainly get that all you bowed low, right? That's that sort of that grieving again. But quenching spring, cleansing pool. So I will admit, this is, I think, somewhat, Susan Briehl is imagining a really wonderful celebration of the Eucharist. But ours does not always have bread enough to break and share, festive wine that scents the air. Sometimes our altar guild would need to raise the game a little bit for us to have bread enough to break and share and festive wine to scent the air. But it's a lovely phrase and maybe an aspiration for having much more beautiful, fresh baked bread just out of the oven and really good wine. But anyhow, it's good. Oh, good morning, Margaret. Welcome.
The last line packs tremendous punch, I think. Beloved, Christ among you stands, moving through your hearts and hands. Mm-hmm. Tremendous.
And yeah. That's certainly one that I think, once again, goes right back to that gospel lesson, right? You know, Jesus standing in your midst, right? And it makes us suddenly now the disciples, which he's standing in the midst.
It's really a beautiful hymn. I would hate to see it just relegated to once every 3 years.
No, and I think that you're right. And I think because it's not so specifically about that, therefore it would be okay to sing it throughout Easter, communion, yeah. And this is one that I do think not every congregation would be able to even adopt this harmony. It's a little bit much. This is certainly within St. John's purview. This is something that I think we can tackle. But, you know, the book has to kind of hold varying different skill sets. So I don't think this will get super wide scale use just because it is a little bit more sophisticated in the way that moves the rhythm, but very nice. Good morning, Margaret. Good morning.
Good morning, Margaret.
Hi.
All right. So since we had Zeb Hyben, I thought we'd just throw this one in real quick following him.
There's another thing to that tune.
To this tune, yes. So we have this in ELW as listen, O people, open your ears, O faithful people, listen to the word, which is more the original text that it comes from. It's a Hasidic tune, kind of ora, tora, it goes faster and faster. But Zeb Hyben, so that's a great text or great tune. How about we use it when there was a group that was put together to try to make more resources for the Easter Vigil. And so this takes the Song of Isaiah from Isaiah 12 and puts it to that tune. And it's, I think, really great because then you can also sing this not just with an organ or piano, but you can sing it a cappella or with instruments. But it's the, surely God is my salvation. I will trust and shall not fear. God the Lord is mighty and mighty, my salvation true. Shout and sing, right? You know, so it's just a paraphrase, but I do think it'll be nice to have that a tune a second time to be able to do it throughout the year. I think we've often had fun with that tune. And so it'll be great to have a second way to sing it. And maybe if we get it done well enough, we'll actually be able to do it like a cappella at the vigil. Won't that be fun? Maybe with a tambourine or something, you know, in a circle and clapping. That'd be kind of fun. All right. All right, so moving on to somebody else. Susan Palo Cherwien. I know at some session we mentioned her briefly. And ELCA, is someone typing?
Yes, I am. Sorry.
Oh, it's okay. If you just would mute yourself, that's all. No worries, no worries. Same with like if anyone hums, it's fine. Just mute yourself, because it drowns everyone out. Susan Palo Cherwien, a poet, professor, laywoman, ELCA member, based out of Minnesota. Her husband is also quite well known, David Cherwien, directs the National Lutheran Choir, lots of great organ stuff, musician at Mount Olive Lutheran Church in Minneapolis. She wrote all these hymns in our book. We know some of her texts. We know Day of Arising very well. That's probably her one that we know best. Oh, and Rise, O Church, like Christ Arisen. Some of the others we have attempted, not all of them. So let's look at a few of hers, and then we'll also talk about her more generally. So this is one of hers, also with Bob Farley. In sacred manner may we walk upon the fair and loving earth, in beauty move, in beauty love, and living round and proud us worth. We stand on holy ground, we stand on holy ground. I'll let you kind of read through it. This one certainly makes sense, has a lot of sort of seeing the sacred in nature, right, in the world we live in. I would say particularly Susan Cherwien in general, and you certainly get, this is a good example of it, she has rather evocative poetry. She has a very, very large vocabulary. I'm sure she got a top score on the SAT in verbal. Like here you get the luminous and loving stars and the suspirant and loving green. She has really, really this big vocabulary, and it's wonderful. I will say personally, both her texts we have already in ELW and some of the ones being added, sometimes I get a little lost in just what we're singing about. I don't know if any of you ever had it, but sometimes they're almost so evocative that I'm not always sure just what the focus is. But maybe that's just me and I need to work on that. So you read and see what you think. I do love the last verses though of this. 5 and 6 are good.
Animals.
Isn't that kind of fun? In sacred manner may we live among the wise and loving ones, sit humbly as at sages' feet by four-legged, finned, and feathered ones. The animals will teach. That's kind of nice, right? It's kind of fun.
Yes.
And I like the personification in every single verse,
Mm-hmm.
where these aspects of nature or animals take on human qualities. Love it.
Yeah, I like the whole creation theme.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's an easier tune than some of her tunes.
Well, yeah, I mean, so she never writes the tunes. She's only a text writer, but depending on who she's paired with, this is an easier tune, yeah. Seattle by Bob Farley.
Mhm.
So, all right, I think enough about that. We're just going to kind of move through something. But this is another one. This was prepared a few years ago for an evening service she and her husband David prepared. Makes sense because the new hymnal, both as it's adding in a lot more earth imagery, which we saw in the last one. It also wants more resources for evening. I don't actually know how the harmony on this one goes, but something of but very much imagining gathering in the evening and gathering it at evening. So it has elements of sort of what we would sing at Vespers, but it begins to sort of also use that for communion, right? Let evening lamps enkindled flame. That's a Vespers sort of thing, but the table Christ has spread. So I think it's imagining communion at night, right? In ways that we bring those things together. Which, as we know, more and more of our churches are doing that, including our own sometimes, right? Having worship connected with the evening, connected with dinner church or evening prayer or something like that. So there we go. Another one by Susan Palo Cherwien. This was done in an anthem along with this fellow here, Mike Costello. Michael Costello is an ELCA pastor, trained at Southern Seminary, but has spent much of his career, I think he was a congregation for a couple years, but as a church musician. And he is the cantor, organist, director of music at Grace River Forest, one of our very, very sort of famous churches. Originally LCMS, and it's now sort of independent pseudo ELCA. But anyhow, right on the campus of Concordia River Forest, the LCMS college. So that's an interesting history. But very, very, very famous music program there. Paul Bowman was there for decades and decades. Bach Vesper is very famous. So he continues that tradition for the last at least decade. But has written many, many anthems and music things, publishing house. This is, I'm guessing, a Lenten text and tune. So it goes like this. As your spirit in the desert led your Christ to dust and stone, so instill our hearts with courage now and cross where Christ has gone. Let us cross into the wilderness, so to walk where Christ has gone. I think a tune that's much, while it's brand new, a tune that's more like tunes we're used to. I think this will be an easier tune to adopt. But I'm thinking, particularly imagining Lent 1, right? Jesus in the wilderness. We got text for that, but this one I think does some new stuff that we've not, especially because it puts us in, let us go to the wilderness. Let us be, and find God there. Which a lot of our preaching often does, but our hymns not always. They've often just been about, Jesus, as you suffered, as you were hungry, let us fast and keep good Easter. And he also, I think something that's new for a Lenten hymn to have the verse in verse 4. Through the narrow gate now draws past all empires, pull and strife, where beyond our fear and clinging stands the threshold of new life. I mean, that would be new for a Lenten hymn, to sort of ask us to sort of step beyond what it means to be powerful in the empire and to follow Jesus. Certainly in scripture, but not something we've often sung about for the last, 1,000+ years of Christendom. We're only kind of more recently picking up on, maybe it wasn't always so good for when the church and the state were too closely bound in power. Maybe that's not quite what Jesus had in mind when he was doing his work. Any comments about this one, or stop me if I'm going too fast. I know we have a lot of stuff to look at. So if it's one I don't have a lot to say, I'm kind of moving quickly. Okay. So this is another one. This is before the ancient one, Christ stands. And by the way, as I said, I had a slide about it. This is Bob Farley down here on the left. Robert Buckley Farley. He's in a lot of our tunes in our ELW and in several new ones. He is an ELCA pastor, grew up in Missouri Synod, became ELCA, but has spent much of his life in ministry in music. For many, many years, he just retired, I think a year ago. He was on the editorial staff at Augsburg Fortress. So he was one of the people who reviewed when submissions came in for anthems, choral music, hymnals. So he was very involved with ELW. I will say there's a long history that if you're ever either on the committee or if you work at the publishing house, it's a good chance your stuff makes it into the book a lot. And that has certainly been true. In previous generations, it was Carl Schalk and Hillert, and in current generations, it's people like Bob Farley, but has done good stuff. I'm not sure everything he writes will stay in the stuffs of time in 30 years when we come back to a new hymnal, but it's good. This tune, just because it's called Christ Church Minneapolis. And so his side gig for many, many years has been as one of two of the directors of music, cantor, at Christ Church Lutheran in Minneapolis. And this is Christ Church Minneapolis, which is a very, very famous building congregation. Eero Saarinen, just a little bit of church architecture history, he designed this church. And it was sort of the first big monumental shift of that post-war Lutherans building in a totally new style. So in some ways you can see how this inspired St. John's. We got a much more simpler version. And this one was, I think, much more successful than many of our churches we built after. But this is kind of the first one that began that whole movement we did after the Second World War of tearing down our old Swedish and Norwegian and German looking buildings and building very, very modern. So anyhow, it's on the National Historic Register. He, along with the person here on the far right, is Martin Seltz, who has both been his colleague as the joint director of music at Christ Church, as well as his shared partner as the co-editor at Augsburg Fortress. So they worked Monday through Friday and Sunday together for the last like 30 years. Yeah, this is an interesting text. It's a long tune. Every verse is a long verse. What do you think of the text if you've had a chance to look at it and what it might have been intended for? Or at least what I'm thinking it's intended for.
Is it like ascension, or it's after Easter because he's standing there with the wounds?
So I think you could sing it Ascension. That's true. I'm actually thinking it's, what was that?
Christ the King?
I'm thinking it's particularly thinking about Christ the King. I mean, I think you could sing it at Ascension too, but I'm thinking it's Christ the King. And I think in some ways it's also trying to somewhat upset. A lot of our most classical Christ the King hymns are very much Christ, conqueror, in power and glory. This is power and glory, but this one I think wants to push that idea that, remember, Christ is a different kind of king. You get that in several of these, right? His glory was the gentle tear, humility his purple garb, the healing hand his royal orb. Such love drew ire, and ire drew death. But God has proved the truer strength, and through all space, host proclaims the name above all other names. Once again, so question, what do you think? I actually think when I read this as poetry, I think it's really beautiful. But when I try to sing it, I get a little bit lost. Does anybody else ever have that a little? That's my only problem with Susan Palo Cherwien's text, is I love them when I read them, but when I sing them, I occasionally have to remember just what all the pieces are.
I think it is difficult to sing. I do think one of his strengths is writing organ preludes. He writes wonderful organ preludes on some of the other new hymns and LBW and ELW. And I think they're some of the best. I like that better than this tune.
Yes, yeah, he has done wonderful. And actually, so I would say, I was able to discover this one. He's actually already written a volume in Augsburg Fortress of new introductions and preludes on some ELW tunes that didn't have much, as well as 4 hymns that hadn't been published. So he has actually already written us a prelude on this piece, even though it hasn't been printed yet. But that's how I was able to get the text and tune. So
I wanted to just mention that Robert Buckley Farley, as I think you indicated, has been involved with the ALCM since its inception. He's brilliant. He's so talented. He was one of the plenary speakers recently at one of the conferences, and he's as humble and as gentle as he is gifted. He's pretty exceptional. I'm going to throw out names, but I did have breakfast with him in Portland just last year, and with Ann Krentz Organ. I couldn't say a word at the table. I could hardly eat. It was a little overwhelming.
Those are sort of 2 all-stars in the current ELCA, yeah. And they're both, and you're right, I have met both of them personally, and they're both lovely, lovely people. They're
We actually hired, we commissioned Ann Prince Organ to write an anniversary piece for Lisa Wickman at her 30th anniversary of being a church musician. Lots of fun.
Yeah, no, they're very talented. And I do want to say that, I mean, I don't mean to discourage. I think Susan Cherwien is very, very talented. And I certainly think Bob Farley is talented. I just, my only comment, I'm not sure that all of their things, as should be, right, will survive. As in, we sang dozens and dozens of Schalk and Hiller things that have now said, those were good for the 70s. Yeah, but no, they're very, very talented and truly committed to the church, committed to our church, I think. You know, they really, really want hard to be able to give us things to sing and play, so.
I just wanted to say, I thought it was an interesting, before the ancient one, I thought that was an interesting image that I don't think of that image when I think of our current hymns anyway. So.
Right, I mean, it is an old, even scriptural one, but it's not one we often talk about when trying to say, like, you know, before God, right? I mean, it's a different way of sort of trying to evoke, I think, the power and majesty without necessarily the old man with the big white beard, right? Which is a lot, I think it's trying to somehow get at that. But it's certainly, even in the Old Testament, right, this often this image of the ancient one. So since we were also on Bob Farley, I sort of snuck him in here too. This is one that's going to be in here. This is a text that we've had forever. We have it in ELW to Elicombe, the day of resurrection, tell its John abroad, which is sort of what the Episcopalians sing it to. It was to a different tune in LBW, the day of resurrection, tell. In the hymnal companion, I actually wonder if this is where this is from. Paul Westermeyer posited that he thinks that this text, by the way, goes back to the early church. I mean, this is John of Damascus. This is in the 1st century of Christianity, 696 to 754. We've been singing this. It comes from the Greeks. The Greek Orthodox would sing this hymn every Easter evening, not to any of these tunes, but and in Greek. But it's this text has kind of been searching for a tune. Some sing it to Lancashire, the day of resurrection, or tell it out abroad. So he said he thinks it was still looking for a tune. So I think Bob Farley said, okay, I'll take you up on that challenge and I'll try my hand. So this is his tune. So now we're going to have the same text, but 2 different tunes in our book. And I'll try playing a little bit of it. But the day of resurrection. I actually think it gives the hymn a much more modern sound, modern feeling. So just wanted to throw that out there that we are going to have a second tune, which we can play around with and decide what we like. But another thing from Bob Farley. Okay, finally moving to some other stuff. Jeanette Lindholm, she's going to be in here once. She is an ELCA background professor at Salem State there in Washington, a laywoman. Professor of poetry has nothing to do with theology, but she did grow up in the ELCA, but she's been very concerned with feminism and feminine roles of portrayals of women, and she decided that she was tired in her church of not having enough good feminist hymns. So she's written some. One we have in ELW was Unexpected and Mysterious. It's an Advent hymn. It's really wonderful. We've been kind of learning that the last couple of years. It's beautiful, beautiful. Kind of looks at it much more from Mary's standpoint. But we're going to get a second one by her, a creation hymn to a tune we already know, St. Columba. So see whether you like this. So this, you would know, we know this.
We've sung that.
Oh yeah, no, we know this is The King of Love, My Shepherd Is. We certainly know this tune. So this will not be a new tune, but a new text to us and a new creation text. So see what you think about it. She does some different things than we're sometimes are used to having with a creation hymn.
Okay. This love remained, this time revealed.
Actually, I'm wondering, Somi, this, apropos to conversations we've had, I wondered if you would like this hymn, particularly the verses 2 and 3.
Spare so deep.
I like it, and I know the hymn. I know the St. Columba music too. That's familiar to me.
Because at least part of what I was getting is I think that in this creation hymn, it's creation and the fall, but she never actually names
God.
God. It's capital love, right?
Right.
God, the divine is named as love.
Yeah.
But she's also wanting to play with, I think, the idea of the fall. She very much still has here, right, that we've somehow fallen into sin, and yet is wanting to say that despair so deep, so deep it bears no name, or sorrows paralyzing, cannot revoke love's faithful claim to dwell within our dying. The love that called creation good, all goodness still is bringing. So this idea that even in the midst of our failing, our sinfulness, love still has its mark on us. We're still created into the image of a loving God, and we'll be brought back to a loving God. So just, one that I think for a lot of people won't feel all that new, and yet it is doing some different things that we've often talked about before.
He's not naming Eve as being the responsible for everything evil in the world.
That's a good thing.
Right. Which is a long tradition, right, of blaming it on the women, right? And so clearly, Jeanette did not want that, right? She did not want a hymn anymore that talks about how Eve fell or Adam sinned and God punished them, right? To be able to name we're created, and we, it's not that she's, I think, slips away from the idea of sinfulness.
No.
Because several verses, grieving, despair, deep, but tries to find a way to say it without sort of running into some of those traps we've sometimes done in the past.
I like having some other words than sin. I like having some other words than sin. So I like the way she handles it. And I also, of course, like that she emphasizes God's ongoing love.
Mm-hmm. And even sorrow's paralyzing. Isn't that interesting? The idea that we could be in such sorrow that we're literally paralyzed with grief. It's a wonderful image. Great. So that's the one addition we're going to get to her in the new book. Another big figure, really recent, Adam Tice. So Adam is relatively young, right? He's 40, going to be 41. Nothing of his in ELW. He really is, I guess he would be the end of the end of the Gen Xers or the very first millennials. So, but finally we have sort of millennials in our hymnal. But he is a Mennonite, trained layman. Well, he did serve as a minister. They have their own way of dealing with, ministers don't have to be ordained. Anyhow, but took up hymn writing and that's now become his primary vocation, is hymns and texts. He's currently serving as the editor of the new Mennonite hymnal, which is just due out this fall, Voices Together. It's over here on the right. But written lots of really new texts, and we're going to get some of them in our new book. So this is one of them. This is actually one I recommended. I really like this a lot. So you're going to recognize the tune, at least I think you will. It's Wayfaring Stranger. Sometimes our only song is weeping, our only sound is grasping breath. Sometimes it seems that God is sleeping, while our brief lives are bound in death. Who hears the song our sorrows swallow, and offers hope to calm our fears? When all our words seem frail and hollow, God heeds the prayers within our tears. A tune that I think we know right from folk music. For Appalachia, it crosses both white, black tradition. Are people familiar with Wayfaring Stranger? No? Okay. It is a well-known, sorry, Linda, you were gonna say something?
Yeah, yeah, it's pretty standard. On the bottom, it says African American spiritual too, I don't know. It's just been part of my music rep forever. So it's not, it's there.
Yeah, and it crosses both African American and white gospel traditions have both of it. If you go to any folk music, this will often be sung. It's kind of that minor, which I think actually helps that a lot of people, I think it sounds familiar. It's Pentatonic, sounds American. But a text that talks about So the first verse is all a lament, right? And the second is sort of the hope. And I like that all throughout it, it's that sometimes the only thing we can do is sing when we're in our deepest grief. And I think it sort of does the thing. It's sometimes in our singing, our hope returns, right? So our only song for weeping, our gasping breath, God, seems like God is sleeping. I think that's good. But then we catch the faintest humming, far off tune, hearts from the well, the Spirit's coming. The Spirit sings, though we are shaken. Christ has shared our heartfelt cries, restored our weary souls awakened to join God's song that never dies. I think really good, and I actually think this is nice. For lots of different times we might want to talk about lament, about mourning, whether it's a personal grief, a communal grief. I think it's good that it's to a folk tune, because sometimes we need to be able to sing at a time of communal tragedy that's not necessarily in our church with a well-rehearsed tune, right? This is something we could take out with a guitar and sing at a vigil, right? We could sing this in the street. We could sing this in some of those places that we've sometimes needed to be able to have a song to sing when we're hurting. So yeah.
Well, the other thing too about a folk song is they are so much easier to sing. So, yes. And when you can't sing because you're grieving, you need something simple.
And it's in that minor key. So it both has that lament and darkness, but yet there's something about that also kind of feels a little bit like home. I think that kind of Appalachian folk music often somehow, there's something almost kind of comforting in those. And so I think this will be very useful.
I think it's lovely.
And it's kind of nice that it's only 2 verses too, right? Sometimes it's nice to not have a hymn that has, now I love a 12-verse hymn, but sometimes it's good to not have every hymn have to be 1,000 verses to get through it. Another one, we actually tried this out, I think, maybe last year at the Easter Vigil. A really, I think, really fun text. So you're going to know the tune right away. Right, we sing this with several hymns, Holy Manna. But it's all about the creation, and it has some really, really rather fun lyrics. I mean, I think some people, some congregations, and some settings will say this is too much, and that's fine. But I think that there's occasion and place for it. I think children in particular will have a lot of fun with this hymn. It has algae and microbes and also platypuses in the hymn.
Yeah.
And do I see
roly-poly to tea?
Yeah.
Yeah, from the tiny roly-poly to the tree-top tall giraffe, that all of creation is somehow singing God's praise, right?
This is the text is very reminiscent of Andrew Carter's, he did a great three-part song thing on Bless the Lord,
Okay.
and all the animals were included. It's adorable. And this has the same lilt and it's fun.
And I love that it mixes them. And actually, I think it's kind of fun that in verse 2, right, it's the third system, we get spider, human, redwood, gecko, right? We're in there, but we're not particularly lifted up as the single most important thing, right? Which we often would. Usually if a hymn mentioned creation, it would kind of be orders of creation building up to humanity. Here it's just thrown right in after the spider, before the redwood and gecko, monkey, chicken, moose, and snake, live within a single fabric, cloth that only God could make, right? So I mean, it's intrinsically Christian, right? There's nothing about it that says that this is not a hymn. It's not just a song that lists earth things, but also I love that, penguin, platypus, and snail, cactus, sea slug, oak, and algae, from the microbe to the whale, right? So one of our smallest to one of our biggest creatures. In this great and strange creation, with a breath, God gives us birth, born of soil to live as stewards, called to love and serve the earth. So I'm thinking, this particularly is good at the Easter Vigil. This is good at any kind of Earth Day, creation time. Great just in the summer, great with kids.
Blessing of the animals.
Blessing of the Animals, St. Francis Day, yeah. And I think it's fun that it's a tune that we already know, right? So it's not like we have to learn a new hard tune to go with. It's also early American shaped note.
The tune is lively, it goes with it, you know.
Right, yeah, it's
The
peppy.
whole thing fun.
But I think I'm probably right. I can definitely see certain places, certain people rolling their eyes and saying this is just too much for sacred worship, and that's okay. You know, there's a place for grand texts. We've had some really grand texts. I think this is one that's more simple. So, another Tice text, which is going to be in here. This one, it doesn't do it justice because I don't have the accompaniment, but it's kind of a jazzy accompaniment, but kind of slow jazz. But once again, wanted to talk about the way that we experience it. So, God bestows on every sense beauty as hope evidence, signs of what the earth will be, just beyond what we can see. There's not a D there. But here I think it's wanting us to kind of use take in our senses, all the ways that we get a sense of the divine through the known earth. This is a little bit more of his evocative writing than the last one, certainly, right? Vibrant pictures in our dreams, brushed with crystal color schemes. But what about 4? I'm thinking that's sort of new to a hymn, to be able to talk about in a burnt and blackened field, broken ground begins to yield, tiny fragile sprouts of green, hints of forest yet unseen, right? So, I mean, this is as old as time, right? That, you know, things burn down and yet new life springs up. But particularly in this time where we're needing to talk about how do we get beyond our sort of scorched earth, ruin the earth, and yet see God's handiwork. That's a metaphor of new life and creation, resurrection, right? When things that have burned down and we have a new green shoot. That's Isaiah, right? A green shoot comes from a stump. But I think a new way of singing about it than we would have historically done. Okay. Another Tice. So this is Sally Ann Morris. We mentioned her before. Laywoman, professor of music, I believe Presbyterian. A lot of her stuff, though, very sort of folk idiom, very singable, sort of pianistic. A lot of her stuff from GIA. This one is sort of, I think a lot of these are sort of focusing on this sort of visioning. What is the world like when we live as God intends? And then it uses a series of different sort of parables and stories from Scripture, and helps us, you know, think about, you know, what is the world like, right? If we actually lived like this. You know, calls us to believe when we roam, rivalries end. I suppose that I think probably a strength here is that this is one that could be sung then with a lot of different lectionary texts, right? You've got the tending your lamps, right, in verse 4, right? You know, the bridesmaids staying awake. You've got the mustard seed parables in verse 1. Welcoming the child, we just had this last week. That's verse 2. One's about care for your neighbor, right? No more is neighbor just ally or friend. Peace thrives in places where once there was none. I don't have anything more to say about that other than I just wanted to throw that out to you. All right, another composer, David Bjorlin. He's professor at North Park Seminary, pastor of worship and liturgy, both professor and then also serves as a pastor, in the Evangelical Covenant Church. The Evangelical Covenant, I don't think we know about them as much here in New Jersey, but if we were in Minnesota, we would. It's this sort of grows out of the Swedish pietist movement of Lutheranism. So in Sweden, they were the state church Lutherans who wanted more simple worship and more piety. When they came to this country, they said, to heck with you Lutherans, we don't have to be with you anymore. So they took sort of Lutheran theology, but are much more, a little more evangelical in their practice and theology. But David Bjorlund, he's a good guy. He wants to, so he would be truly a millennial, being 84. See some younger people. Has written several new texts that are very concerned with the way we live right now. So this is a new text to a tune we will know, so it's very easy, but feels extremely timely to our current situation. So you know, right, we know it in our hymnal, the Easter hymn, Love Has Come Again, but also the Christmas hymn, Sing We Now of Christmas. But what do you think about this text? Build a longer table, not a higher wall.
Social justice.
Social justice, yeah.
Feels very, very timely, right? And build a safer refuge, not a larger jail.
Can we sing this at our protests?
But I will say it's not just a political statement. I mean, all of these, he's rooting them in Scripture, right? I mean, it's in Scripture. It says, right, Christ has come down to tear down the wall of our iniquity. He talks about setting the prisoner free. I mean, all this is scriptural. Where the weak find shelter, mercy will not fail. For any place where justice is denied, love will break down the jail walls, freeing all inside. I mean, that's Isaiah, right? Set the captives free. Let them go. Build a broader doorway, not a larger fence. Love protects all people, sparing no expense. When we embrace compassion more than fear, love tears down our fences, all are welcome here. When we lived as exiles, refugees. So here we're thinking about the scripture, right? A wandering Aramaean was our ancestor, right? I mean, he's rooting all this, and it's deeply, deeply rooted in scripture. But I think he's wanting to really, to push us on at least some rhetoric that's currently going on that would say, good Christian folks don't have to welcome neighbors and don't have to, welcome. So I think it's a very, very timely text.
I have a question on verse 4.
Yeah.
Could you comment on the elimination of O in God?
Yeah. And I'm curious, I'm guessing that they will print it as that. I mean, so all of this is not like galley copies, right? This is my bootlegged edition of All Creation Sings, certainly, but this is how it usually is done. So usually that is done, particularly amongst Orthodox Jews.
Yes, that's why I'm so curious.
Right, of dropping the vowel. So in Hebrew, right, this is where, rather than the sacred name, they see it and they pronounce Adonai or Elohim. But even when in English, they usually still drop the vowel. It's just a sort of a sign of respect that we will just, God is so holy, we can't use God's name.
Yeah, I knew that, but I'm just wondering why it was included in an evangelical covenant church philosophy.
Right. So I'm thinking that even though he's evangelical covenant, I know David Bjorlund really is much more on the vanguard of trying to be very fresh and new. As much as it's a conservative tradition, he's very much on the modern end. And I'm wondering if it's his practice, sort of out of respect and following that tradition, that he himself always drops the vowel in God. But yes, I had myself noticed that. It's also, by the way, the kind of thing, like in our Bible, we often miss this, but in the Old Testament, if you ever see, like, blessed is the name of the Lord, and L-O-R-D is all capital, that means that in Hebrew, that's the actual name of God. But there's this long tradition that we Christians don't always observe, right? We long used to have hymns that said, guide me, O thou great Jehovah, which is a way of trying to say God's name, or even in the 70s, Yahweh, Yahweh, you are my God. Nowadays, we mostly would say, out of respect for at the very least, our Jewish roots, let's not try to pronounce the sacred name of God, because that's, for them, it's so holy, don't touch it, right?
Thanks.
Sure. Another David Bjorlund, this one much more earthbound. I'm thinking that I need the harmony. I don't know the harmony, but as rivers. another one about the earth, right, and the way that we can live in God's earth more creative. I don't have much more thing to say about that, but I think that'll probably do. I always go slower than I think I'm going to. Okay, finally onto a different genre. I promised you this last week, and now in our final 15 minutes or so, we'll finally get to another one. So we are getting several more spirituals, is one of the things this new book is adding. And this is one of them. So Deep River. We're not going to go through and sing all these. A lot of you know them. Deep River, my home is over Jordan. But it's one of the ones that we'll be adding. It's great to, ELW added a lot of spirituals. LBW had, 2? Were You There and Let Us Break Bread Together. So the fact that LBW has, a dozen? That was a big deal. And I think they're adding at least 8 or a dozen more. So that's really wonderful to have this really rich tradition. So we're getting Deep River, Every Time I Feel the Spirit.
Right.
Wonderful Pentecost hymn. Every time I feel the Spirit moving in my heart, I will pray. Also, I think these are great. On the whole, I think we found that they're good for the whole church, and they're really, they're African-American spirituals, but this is American heritage, right? African-American heritage is American history and heritage. And so in many ways, we've often been deprived of this rich heritage in the quote unquote white churches by not having them. So this is great. But I think they're also wonderful because they're folk music, right? They were written not to be played on organs and pianos. They didn't have them, right? The melodies are intrinsically singable, right? You can sing them a cappella, you can sing them with the drum, you can sing them jazzed up. They're such simple music. And therefore both our really big, elaborate, rich congregations with big music programs can do them, but often even our really simple places where there's, Betty Ann, the volunteer pianist who took piano in 3rd grade, can still sometimes find a way to sing this music, right? So I think it's what's really great about them. It's not that they're simplistic, but that they're simple and wonderful to grasp. So
I have one question on that one. You could just go back. So there are so many variations on the melody. So I'm wondering how the editors of this new supplement how do they make decisions about which exact melody to use?
Yes, this is true. And this is probably, there's occasionally ones that I learned it a different way, an X version, and that's hard. I will be interested. Thus far, at least with ELW, and my hunch is probably with this, they've tended to follow the setting of the melody and the harmony that we first got with This Far by Faith, which was the African-American ELCA LCMS joint hymnal. Now that committee, like every committee, had to make decisions, but they've tended to follow that because it was a group of African-American Lutherans brought together to say, how do you sing it, right, in your church? So, and it's true. I mean, not that there's one African-American Lutheran experience, but African-American Lutheranism very well may sing some of these songs differently than African-American Methodism or African-American Baptist. The only challenge is if we learned the tune first from another way. So all of these, I will say, are what's currently in This Far by Faith, is the version I brought over. So I'll be interested to follow too, because actually there's some myself that I'm like, oh, I was taught that a little differently. I was taught that, but.
The one that comes to mind is How Can I Keep From Singing? I guess with one voice, and the rhythms and the melodies are just a little bit different from the way I was raised. I just am curious about the editing process, like where did they come? But what you said makes perfect sense. Thank you.
And you're right. It's like, it's almost always up to editors and a committee. And as we know, that's both the blessing of more than one person involved, and it's the curse of a committee, because someone's got to win and someone's got to lose and everyone has to compromise. So Every Time I Feel the Spirit, we're also getting, I'm really glad we're getting this one. Guide my feet while I run this race. Guide my feet while I run this race. Spiritual. It's so great because it's not tied to any one time, right? It's not tied to a time of year. It's a wonderful call to action. And also, by the way, this is a great one to literally march to or to walk to, right? So this is a great one to use in procession, but also to use in a protest march, or to use in a outdoor service, or to use in a, process from hymn and hall to the sanctuary, right? I mean, but this idea of, and it's using the scriptural image of running this race, right? which Paul has, right? Run the race set before you. But guide my feet, hold my hand, stand by me. I'm your child while I run this race. And it's great. You can kind of just throw out, use as many of them as you need and you keep going. So I think this will be very useful. Welcome table. We have done this sometimes at St. John's. I'm gonna eat at the welcome table. I'm gonna eat at the welcome table some of these days. This is one, by the way, that has a million different harmonizations. So I'll be interested to see which one we get, because that's the one we're gonna have to start singing. But using this image both of the table at communion, but also the table in heaven, the table that all are welcome at. So good. Keep your lamps trimmed and burning, an Advent text, sort of great for November, December. Have long sung it as a choral anthem. Keep your lamps trimmed and burning, keep your lamps trimmed and burning, keep your lamps trimmed. I think some of us know this, right? Children, don't grow weary, children, don't grow weary. Yeah, I think that'll be really easy and fun to add. When the saints go marching in, right? I think many of us know this from Sunday school, but the fact that it was never in our hymnal. Oh, when the saints go marching in. So both fun for, an All Saints Day, but also just sort of in general, whenever we need to have these lifting up the saints of the church to be able to have a hymn that's not just big organ for all the saints, right? Which I love them, but it's kind of nice to have something, a different style as well. So I'm going through these really fast, but only because I assume a lot of these are kind of familiar. Take Me to the Water. Love this baptism hymn. We actually did this for the first time here in January because I went to as I know from seminary classmates, both in the AME and in at least some Black Baptists, this is the baptism hymn that they expect to hear. Right? If you're going to have a baptism, they're going to sing "Take Me to the Water." But I love it. I think it's great because it can just cycle. Right? As we used it in January, we used it as people came up to reaffirm their baptism, and it could just keep cycling. Right? It's not teze, but it's cyclical. Right? It has that you just keep singing it, and the more you sing it, in some ways, the more spiritual I feel like it becomes. Right? So wonderful. We're also getting a little bit more gospel music. As you may know, in the historically white churches, for a long time, gospel music was really, really seen as bad news, right? We did not like gospel music. It springs up right in the 1910s and 20s. At least into the 70s and 80s, you were not allowed to think about gospel music in churches. That was not good music. We've brought in, thanks be to God, some more. So that's Precious Lord, Take My Hand, Lead Me, Guide Me. We've added some. We're still woefully lacking in gospel music, but we've added some. So this is going to be one. We've done this. I will say one challenge to gospel music is that it's often printed one way and to be played slightly differently. It's often supposed to be sort of swung and sort of 9/8, 12/8, which is a little bit hard because what you don't want to do is play this. Right, that would be extremely white. But a wonderful, we'll walk in the light. Do the little claps, right? A great sort of Christmas Epiphany tide hymn. Really glad we're getting this. We've sung this a little bit at St. John's already. Another one for the gospel traditions coming in new. So, thank you, Lord. Thank you, Lord. Thank you, Lord. I just want to thank you. simple, but has some of those interesting chords that we've not historically, right? Like, but really great, right? Use this at the offering, use this at communion, use it at the end of the service. But glad that we're adding in some more of the African American music. This is, I would say, for the African American music, probably the biggest tidal wave shift for me, that this is going to be in our Lutheran hymnal. Total Praise. This is a standard classic of the last, I don't know, 20-ish years in the African American church. They know it, they love it, their choirs belt it out. By Richard Smallwood, that's this fellow over here on the left. He is a huge figure in African American sort of gospel, of the more modern gospel. But it's something that we have not had before. So anybody know Total Praise already? No? All right, so this is, so this is sort of showing, so it's, Lord, I will lift mine eyes to the hills, knowing my help is coming from you. Lord, peace you give me in time of the storm. You are the source of my strength. You are the strength of my life. I lift my hands in total praise to you. That would repeat, and then we get this. Amen. Very different, right, than a lot of the stuff we've historically sung. But in many ways, beautifully classical. I mean, he was trained classically, but these really rich harmonies, but in a different style, right? Particularly the you are the strength of my strength. I lift my hands. I lift my hands. I mean, very chromatic. What do you think?
I think it'll be fun to learn.
I like it.
And it'll be fun to have the choir singing chords with it.
Right, yeah, and those really crunchy chords, right?
I love that 7 or 12 or whatever it is, fold amen at the end too. It's
Right? Which takes a lot of practice, both to sing or play it, right? It's like, where am I going? I think that the benefit of the
It'll be a rockin' sockin' once they learn it.
yeah, and that's my experience in African American churches that, like I said, know this. They sing it without the music in front of them, right? They know it. The beauty of it is it's one verse, right? You do, but it begins, and then by that amen, they usually amen. I mean, they're just sort of belting it, right? But it's this and a paraphrase. I mean, paraphrase back, but evocative of Psalm 121, right? Unto the hills I lift mine eyes. But that God is the strength of my source, and I will lift my hands in total praise to you. So I'm really glad that I actually wish that we were getting, there's a second Richard Smallwood piece that's sort of the other everybody has. But the fact that we've got one, good, finally. Okay, just about, this will be our last one for today. Just because this is something not at all like gospel music necessarily, or gospels, but it does fit with these because of David Hurd. So a stable lamp is lighted. Anyone remember in LBW, a stable lamp is lighted? A stable lamp is lighted, whose glow shall wake the sky, the stars shall bend their voices. Anyone remember that?
Yes.
Was it Tofelson? We were actually, St. John's was one of the congregations that actually knew that text and tune and sang it and loved it. And actually I have a few people who regularly say, why can't we still sing it? Well, we can't, because actually Tofelson has really restrictive copyright stuff, and we don't have that copyright privilege. Anyhow, but I know, as they were reviewing LBW, it's one of the hymns that came in with one of the lowest scores from congregations to say, we don't like this hymn, we don't sing it, we don't know it. So we got rid of it. It was a text by Richard Wilbur. That's the guy at the top. He was, I believe, an American poet laureate professor. So written in the 50s, right, 59. A very different Christmas hymn, right? It really wants to connect Christmas with Palm Sunday, right? And Christmas with Christ's Passion and what's coming. So we didn't have it in ELW, but David Hurd, the fellow down here at the bottom here, Dr. Hurd, is an African-American Episcopalian musician, doctor of music and organ. He was for, 30 years, the professor of church music and organist at General Seminary in New York City. He's still an active church organist, but he has retired from that position. Has written many, many pieces. I mean, he is a, no bones about it, classically trained Anglican choral organ of the highest degree. Has written a lot of good music in the Anglican Church. We actually are kind of deprived that we have almost none of it. I think that's really a failure of our tradition that we have not adopted more of it. But he does write, how do I say this? He is a classical, high church Anglican, high church classical musician, but he is an African-American musician. And he does write with a certain amount of jazz idiom too. And so I think it's great that we're getting now this tune that he wrote, which is actually, this hymn is now paired to this tune in most other hymnals if they have it. So it's a very different feel. A stable lamp is lighted, whose glow shall wake the sky. The stars shall bend their voices, and every stone shall cry. And every stone shall cry, and straw like gold shall shine. A barn shall harbor heaven, and all become a shrine. It's much more kind of this gentle lilting. Does anyone know this tune? IDR?
No.
I know it well. 2 Christmases ago, I went and worshiped at St. Peter's Episcopal in Morristown, where our daughter sings and has a church job there. And I was so moved by this. I became really emotional for lots of different reasons, but it is a beautiful text and a beautiful melody. So we actually, this outreach music group that I co-direct called Agape, we ordered it and used it last year. Just beautiful. And it's got all kinds of simple, like a flute or recorder instrumental section. It's just stunning.
Yeah, usually, David Hurd's, as I said, I mean, his music is anything but simplistic. It's very complex, wonderful music. It often, I feel like, is often very well written, like an organ trio texture. So it's great to be able to pull off one of those and give it to an instrument. The text, the tune that we have by him that we already know is Julian. Da 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 da. As the deer runs to the river. We also did it this Christmas as "Ye who claim the faith of Jesus." But he's written other ones. I'm so glad we're getting at least one other of his tunes. We honestly should have more of his stuff in our book. He's done a fantastic alternate tune to "O Sacred Head." Now I love "O Sacred Head" to the Paul Gerhardt, but one day we'll have to listen to this other tune. It's amazing. But there's really different harmonies. And I think for those who knew the other tune, which was a good tune, but it wasn't, I think this tune does something very different to this text, right? Makes it, I don't know, it's kind of a lullaby, but yet it's not just sweet at all, right? It's very, very moving. I'm glad to have this text back. Right, glad to have finally a Christmas hymn again that says, "This child through David's city shall ride in triumph by. The palm shall strew its branches, and every stone shall cry. And he shall be forsaken and yielded up to die. The sky shall groan in dark, and every stone shall cry." But now, as at its ending, the load be lifted high, the stars shall bring their voice, and every stone shall cry. In praises of the child by whose descent among us the worlds are reconciled. We need to sing that, right? We need Christmas hymns that remind us of Christ came and did not turn his face from suffering, and yet in his suffering and life reconciled us. So, good. Any final comments about this? No? All right, I'm going to stop recording. Nope, stop share.